The rain was coming down in sheets when Jack Harrison spotted her, a crumpled figure on the side of the deserted highway, illuminated only by his headlights. With 3 exhausted 8-year-olds sleeping in the back seat and a storm intensifying, he faced a split-second decision that would alter the course of not just one life, but 5. If you've ever wondered whether fate exists or if some encounters are simply meant to be, this story will answer that question. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this journey already, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Jack hadn't slept properly in 3 years, not since Clara died. The triplets, Emma, Ethan, and Ellie, were just 5 then, and overnight, he'd become both mother and father to 3 identical yet utterly different little souls. That night on the highway, they were returning from his mother's birthday dinner, the first family gathering where he'd managed to smile without it feeling like a betrayal to Clara's memory. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour as Jack squinted through the glass. Someone, was there on the shoulder of the road. His first instinct was to drive past. It was nearly midnight, the kids were asleep, and he'd heard enough stories about highway robberies staged just like this. But something made him slow down. Perhaps it was the memory of Clara, who never passed anyone in need, or perhaps it was simple human decency refusing to be silenced by fear. "Dad? Why are we stopping?" Ethan's groggy voice came from the back seat. "Just stay in the car, buddy," Jack replied, putting on his hazard lights and pulling over about 20 feet ahead of the figure. "Lock the doors if I'm not back in 2 minutes." The woman was face down on the gravel, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle, her dark hair plastered across her face by the rain. Blood mixed with rainwater around her head, diluting into pale pink streams that ran toward the drainage ditch. Jack's heart hammered as he crouched beside her, fingers searching for a pulse while he dialed 911 with his other hand. "Please don't be dead," he whispered, and felt a faint thump against his fingertips just as the emergency operator answered. What Jack didn't know then was that the woman's name was Elena Diaz, that she'd been walking for miles after her car broke down and her phone died, and that the semi-truck that had clipped her never even slowed down. He didn't know she was a pediatric surgeon who had lost her family in a house fire 2 years earlier, or that she'd recently relocated to start over in a new city. All he knew was that she was breathing, barely, and that he couldn't leave her to die in the rain. The paramedics arrived 14 minutes later, by which time Jack had moved his car closer, positioned it to shield them from passing traffic, and wrapped his jacket around the unconscious woman. The triplets were fully awake now, their identical faces pressed against the window, watching with a mixture of fear and fascination as the woman was loaded into the ambulance. "Is she going to die?" Emma asked, her voice small in the darkness of the car. Jack gripped the steering wheel, watching the ambulance pull away. "I don't know, sweetheart. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of it, a good Samaritan deed, a story to tell, perhaps a brief mention in the local paper." Jack would have driven his children home, tucked them into bed, and returned to his exhausting routine of work, school runs, homework help, and grief management. But as he prepared to drive away, Emma spotted something glinting in the beam of their headlights. "Dad! Look," she pointed. It was a locket, simple silver with an intricate engraving, lying where the woman had fallen. Jack picked it up, meaning to give it to the police, but in the chaos of getting the kids home and to bed, it ended up in his pocket. The next morning, when he emptied his rain-soaked jeans, he found it again, opened it, and discovered a tiny photograph of a young girl with Elena's eyes and smile. Something about that photo compelled Jack to visit the hospital. He told himself it was just to return the locket, just to check if she'd survived, but deep down, he recognized a connection, the unmistakable shadow of loss they both carried. The ICU nurse seemed skeptical when Jack explained how he knew Elena, but his sincere concern and the locket convinced her to let him leave his contact information. "She's in critical condition," the nurse explained. "Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and a severe concussion. If you hadn't found her when you did." 3 days passed. Jack tried to focus on his engineering job and the kids' end-of-school-year activities, but his thoughts kept returning to the woman on the roadside. Had she woken up? Did she have family? Why was she walking alone on a highway in a storm? The call came on Thursday evening as he was helping the triplets with their science projects. Elena was awake, the nurse informed him, and had asked to meet the man who saved her life. Jack was surprised. He hadn't expected that responsibility, that connection. But the triplets were intrigued by the mystery woman, and perhaps it would provide closure. What Jack couldn't have anticipated was how Elena's room would fall silent when they entered, how her eyes would widen at the sight of not one but 4 visitors, or how Ellie, usually the shyest of the triplets, would step forward first, offering the small bunch of daisies they'd picked from their garden. "You saved me," Elena said to Jack, her voice raspy from the breathing tube she'd only recently had removed. Jack shook his head. "I just found you. The doctors saved you." "I am a doctor," she replied with a weak smile, "and I know the difference between surviving and being saved." That first visit lasted only 20 minutes before the nurse shooed them out, citing Elena's need for rest. But in those 20 minutes, something shifted in Jack's world. For the first time in 3 years, he felt a connection to someone who understood loss without him having to explain it. The triplets, too, were drawn to Elena. They had grown accustomed to their father's sadness, to the way adults spoke carefully around them, avoiding mention of mothers or families or anything that might remind them of what they'd lost. But Elena was different. When Emma bluntly asked why she was alone on the highway, Elena answered honestly, "I was running away from memories, but they caught up with me anyway." Over the next 2 weeks, as Elena's body began to heal, the Harrisons became regular visitors. Jack brought books, the children brought drawings, and conversations that started cautiously soon flowed freely. Elena learned that Emma was the leader, Ethan the peacemaker, and Ellie the dreamer. Jack discovered that Elena had been driving to a new job across the country, trying to outrun the anniversary of the fire that had taken her husband and daughter. "Do you have a picture of them?" Ethan asked one afternoon, and Jack began to apologize for the personal question when Elena reached for the locket Jack had returned to her. "This is Sophia," she said, showing them the photo inside. "She would have been 7 this year." The room fell silent, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared moment of understanding, of collective grief acknowledged rather than avoided. As Elena's discharge date approached, practical matters intruded on the unexpected connection they'd formed. She had no home in this city, no family to care for her during recovery, and her new job had been filled when she didn't arrive. Jack found himself offering before he'd fully thought it through. "We have a guest room," he said. "Until you figure out your next steps." Elena's initial refusal was adamant. She couldn't impose, couldn't disrupt their lives. But Jack recognized something in her resistance, the same fierce independence he'd clung to after Clara died, the determination not to need help that had nearly broken him. "The kids want you to stay," he said finally, which wasn't manipulation but simple truth. The triplets had grown attached to Elena, bringing her into their conversations about their mother, sharing memories they'd been guarding closely. 2 days later, Jack helped Elena into his home, a modest 4-bedroom house with toys scattered across the living room and science projects occupying the dining table. She moved slowly, still recovering from surgeries to repair her broken arm and ribs, but her eyes took in everything, the family photos that still included Clara, the different colored backpacks by the door, the calendar overflowing with activities. "I can't replace her," Elena said that night after the children were in bed, as they sat on the porch with mugs of tea. "I need you to understand that." Jack nodded, watching the neighborhood settle into darkness. "I'm not looking for a replacement. Clara was, she was part of me. That doesn't change." "I'm not looking to be saved either," Elena added. "Good," Jack replied. "Because I'm not very good at saving. Just ask my bank account." The joke was small, but it broke something open between them, an acknowledgement that they were just 2 broken people trying to survive, without expectations or pressure. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, 2 weeks, they agreed, until Elena, despite her injuries, found ways to contribute, helping with homework when Jack worked late, teaching Emma to braid her hair the way Clara never had the chance to, listening to Ethan's worries about being the only boy, encouraging Ellie's interest in medicine. The first major crisis came 6 weeks after Elena moved in. Jack received a call from school. Ethan had gotten into a fight, something utterly out of character for the gentle middle triplet. With an important client meeting he couldn't miss and his mother out of town, Jack called Elena in desperation. "I can't ask you to. I'm already putting on my shoes," she interrupted. "Text me the school address." When Jack arrived home that evening, he found Ethan and Elena sitting on the front steps, deep in conversation. Ethan's eye was swollen, but he was nodding thoughtfully at whatever Elena was saying. The other kids were inside with Mrs. Patel from next door, who gave Jack a knowing smile as she left. He was defending Emma, Elena explained later, after Ethan was in bed. Another boy was making fun of her for not having a mother. Jack pressed his palms against his eyes. "I should have been there." "You can't be everywhere," Elena said gently. "But we talked about better ways to handle it next time. I hope that's okay." "We?" Jack caught the pronoun, and Elena flushed. "I'm sorry. I overstepped." "No," Jack said quickly. "No, you didn't. I'm grateful. It's been just me for so long." That night marked a turning point. Elena stopped talking about leaving, and Jack stopped asking about her plans. They fell into a rhythm that felt eerily natural, sharing cooking duties, alternating school drop-offs, dividing the mountain of laundry 3 children generated. In quiet moments, they shared stories of the people they'd lost, Clara's terrible singing voice that hadn't stopped her from performing in the shower every morning, David's obsession with vintage comic books, Sophia's imaginary friend who lived in the refrigerator. But beneath the surface harmony, complications simmered. Jack's in-laws, who had been distant but cordial since Clara's death, expressed concerns about Elena's role in their grandchildren's lives. Jack's mother, though supportive, warned him about rushing into anything. And Elena still carried the weight of her interrupted journey, the new life she'd been seeking when fate and a careless driver intervened. The breaking point came 4 months after the accident, when Elena received a job offer from the hospital where she'd recovered, a position in the pediatric surgery department starting immediately. It was everything she'd wanted, a prestigious role, a chance to use her skills, a new beginning. But accepting it meant committing to staying, to building a life in a city she'd never intended to call home. "I don't know what to do," she confessed to Jack one night after the children were asleep. They sat at the kitchen table, her job offer letter between them like a ticking bomb. "What do you want to do?" Jack asked, careful to keep his voice neutral despite the fear gripping his chest, fear that she would leave, that the fragile happiness they'd constructed would collapse. Elena looked around the kitchen, at the children's artwork magnetized to the refrigerator, at the height chart on the wall where her measurements now appeared alongside the family's, at the calendar where her hospital shifts were penciled in alongside soccer practices and dentist appointments. "I want to stay," she whispered. "But I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of replacing them, David and Sophia. Of forgetting them if I'm happy again. Of—" She hesitated, "of losing all of you too." Jack reached across the table then, taking her hand in his. "You know what Clara used to say? The heart is like a house, you can always build more rooms. Loving the kids, being part of our lives, it doesn't erase David and Sophia. It honors them." The tears that had been threatening spilled over then, and Elena gripped his hand like a lifeline. "When did you get so wise?" "Triplets," Jack smiled. "They age you in dog years." The next morning, Elena accepted the job. That evening, they told the children together, braced for questions or concerns. Instead, they were met with bewildered expressions. "We thought you already lived here," Emma said, speaking for all 3. "Like, forever." The adults exchanged glances, and something that had been unspoken between them suddenly felt unavoidable. They weren't just co-parents or roommates or friends, they were becoming a family, pieced together from broken parts but stronger at the seams. The road wasn't smooth, of course. Jack struggled with guilt when he realized he was falling in love again, spending sleepless nights talking to Clara's photograph as if seeking permission. Elena had panic attacks on the anniversary of the fire, convinced she was betraying her family by finding joy again. The triplets tested boundaries, sometimes playing the adults against each other or bringing up Clara at strategic moments. But through it all, they talked, really talked, about fears and hopes and the complicated geometry of grief and love. They established new traditions while honoring old ones, created spaces for remembrance alongside spaces for new memories. 1 year after the accident, on a clear summer evening, Jack took Elena back to the spot on the highway where he'd found her. It was a different place in daylight, just an ordinary stretch of road with wildflowers growing in the ditches, no hint of the drama that had unfolded there. "Why did you bring me here?" Elena asked, puzzled by the pilgrimage to a place of trauma. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, not a diamond, but a silver band inlaid with 4 birthstones, one for each of the triplets and one for him. "Because this is where our story began," he said simply. "And I wanted you to see how far we've come." Elena stared at the ring, then at Jack, her eyes filling with tears. "Are you sure?" "The children help me pick it out," Jack finished for her. "Emma said it had to be silver to match your locket," Ethan insisted on the birthstones, "and Ellie wrote a 10-page story about how you and I are like 2 puzzle pieces that lost their boxes but still fit together." Elena laughed through her tears, and as Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, a truck passed them on the highway, horn blaring at the strange sight of a couple embracing on the roadside. They both jumped, then dissolved into laughter, the kind of full-body, healing laughter that neither had experienced in years. 2 months later, in a simple ceremony in their backyard, Jack and Elena married. The triplets served as both flower girls and ring bearers, solemnly walking down the makeshift aisle together as they'd done everything else in their lives. On a small table near the altar stood 2 photographs, Clara smiling on a beach, and David holding little Sophia on his shoulders. They weren't hidden or apologized for, they were acknowledged as part of the tapestry that had brought everyone to this moment. "You don't replace the people you've lost," Elena said in her vows, looking not just at Jack but at the children who had become hers too. "You build something new with the love they taught you to give." Life after the wedding settled into a new normal. Elena's surgical career flourished, while Jack's engineering firm allowed him to work remotely 2 days a week to balance their schedules. The triplets thrived in the stability of their expanded family, though they still had moments of missing their birth mother or questioning their place in the complex family they'd become. On the triplets' 10th birthday, Elena suggested a special gift. With Jack's blessing, she legally adopted them, while they in turn helped choose a name for the baby sister who would join their family the following spring, Sophia Clara Harrison, a name that bridged past and future. The story of the single dad who stopped for a dying woman on the roadside didn't end with a simple rescue or even with a wedding. It continued through everyday challenges, through Ethan's struggle with learning disabilities, through Emma's teenage rebellion, through Ellie's determination to follow in Elena's medical footsteps. It continued through Elena's difficult pregnancy at 40 and Jack's career changes to support their growing family. It continued through holidays that honored 4 grandparents, 2 living and 2 watching from somewhere beyond. 5 years after that rainy night on the highway, the Harrison family stood together on the beach, watching the sunset. Baby Sophia toddled between her older siblings, who at 13 were no longer identical in personality though they remained so in appearance. Jack and Elena sat on a blanket nearby, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned into him. "Do you ever wonder about the odds?" Jack asked suddenly. "You breaking down on that specific stretch of road, on that specific night, when we happened to be driving by?" Elena watched the children, her heart full of a love she'd once thought impossible to feel again. "I used to think losing my family was the worst kind of bad luck," she replied. Now I think maybe it was just the universe making room for this, for them, for you. That's a pretty optimistic view for someone who crashed into our lives, Jack teased, but his voice was thick with emotion. Elena turned to face him, framing his face with her hands the way she'd done countless times over the years. I didn't crash, she corrected gently. I was lost, and you found me. There's a difference. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the family on the beach, Jack realized that Elena was right. They had all been lost in different ways, him in grief and single parenthood, the triplets in the absence of maternal love, Elena in her solitary journey across the country. But in finding each other, they'd created something miraculous, a family built not on perfect circumstances but on the choice to love despite life's uncertainties. Some would call